Welcome back to the UNCAVED podcast. Today we're meeting with Daniel DiMartino, who is a PhD candidate in economics at Columbia University and a graduate fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he focuses on high-skilled immigration policy. Born and raised in Venezuela, Daniel experienced the terrible consequences of socialism firsthand. After leaving Venezuela for the United States in 2016, he dedicated himself to explaining how socialism destroyed his homeland, advocating for his freedom, and stopping this ideology from ever being implemented in America and elsewhere. Daniel has appeared dozens of times on national TV channels such as Fox News and CNN, written for the USA Today, National Review, and other news outlets, and speaks regularly at college campuses and events all over the country. He has received fellowships from the Institute of Humane Studies and the Job Creators Network. In addition to his economic research on immigration and his media appearances, DiMartino founded the Dissident project to teach high school students about the evils of socialist regimes. Without further ado, here's Daniel DiMartino. Welcome to the UNCAVED podcast, Daniel DiMartino.
Thank you, Ashley.
It's good to see you.
You too.
You've been traveling, so you were in Kansas very recently.
Yes, I went to Kansas to speak at a Christian high school in Wichita for the Dissident project, which is the nonprofit that I run and that I speak for. And so I spoke about my experience in Venezuela to these high school kids. And after that, I drove together with a group to Topeka, Kansas, the capital, because the Kansas Republican Party convention was happening, and they invited me to speak at the Hispanic meeting. And so I went there and spoke. That was a great experience too. Then I flew back from Kansas to New York City. Then I flew to Miami, where I was at a conference. And then I went to DC also for another important meeting. So I've been traveling a lot. This was just last week too, so.
Wow, oh my goodness. Well, you're back in New York. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah, what have you been up to here? What are you doing here now, just class?
Well, I don't have classes anymore. I just work on my research for the PhD. So in the PhD in economics program, how it's structured is that the first 2 years we get classes. The third year, people can get classes. I guess people can take classes optionally after. I chose not to, and I chose to focus on my research. My research is based on immigration economics, so that's my area. And what I'm looking at right now is whether green card caps that became binding for people born in India and China early in the 21st century are affecting U.S. innovation. So our immigration system actually capped the number of people who can come here from each country of birth. So if you happen to be born in India or China, you are actually discriminated against in the high-skilled immigration paths.
EB visas, yes.
Correct, employment-based.
So in high school, I did policy debate, and one of the big topics we did was on immigration reform. And our policy that my team would advocate for was for getting rid of the cap on EB 1 through 4 visas.
Yes, so that's exactly the issue, that there's a cap on the total number of these highly skilled immigrants who can come, and then there's also a cap on the number from each country. There's actually no cap on people who come here from any country except India and China. So if you are, say, a software engineer who happen to be born in India, even if you're a citizen of another country, you will actually never get a green card, even if you're approved. But if you happen to be born in Venezuela, like I was, you will get it.
Yeah, no, it's pretty crazy to looking at the statistics, because the vast majority of tech startup unicorns, that they say, for example, come from usually high-skilled immigrants from India and China. People that are most successful in a lot of these areas. And it's been interesting for me too, as someone that's more on the right, to see in recent years the shift against immigration, which has been kind of frustrating to me too, because it seems to me if it is the case that we love America and want it to succeed the most. Like I love the Gemini sticker on my computer for the longest time. Immigration is by far one of the biggest keys for that. And I'm wondering, where do you, from your perspective, see a lot of the recent friction coming from?
There's a very big difference between open borders and supporting high-skilled immigration, right? These are two very different topics that are actually, I think, unrelated to each other. On the one hand, if your goal is for America to grow economically and to make native-born Americans wealthier, for there to be more jobs, higher wages, for America to lead the technology race against China, and for us to be more powerful militarily, then you should support more immigration of people who are really smart. It's, President Trump said, even though he didn't really follow through policy-wise on this, but he said that we have a very stupid policy of not letting in smart people into the United States. And that's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And that's the logic. If we were able to get non-communist and very smart people away from China and into the United States, we're stealing their human capital, we're brain draining them in order to prop up ourselves and invent more things. Imagine if we hadn't brought in Albert Einstein from Germany. Germany could have even won World War II if they had Albert Einstein, but they didn't. We had him and we won.
For sure, and that's interesting to me too, how you see the national security concern, especially against China, used in arguments back and forth.
Yeah, the people who are against immigration have it the other way around. They actually say we should not let in people from China because China is our enemy. But that's the opposite. That's a gift for China. Mm-hmm. China is actually trying to bring back their citizens away from the United States through their new initiative to bring back human capital. They're paying them over $100K to bring PhD students who are here, born in China, to go back.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so like the best thing we can do against the CCP is actually screw their plan.
Yeah, well, this is why I was recently too, I've heard actually some controversy surrounding H-1B visas in particular. Because even though obviously you and I are really in favor of high-skilled immigration visas, the worry I have with H-1B visas that are temporary is that it allows foreign adversaries to send over human capital here to profit off of our education systems that come from freedom and all these things and import it back to a totalitarian state. So there too, do you have an issue with like H-1B visas?
Well, H-1B visas are not for education, they're for work.
Right.
It would be for the student visas, I imagine that's your concern.
Student visas and H-1B, well, because H-1B visas are the temporary ones, right?
And students too, technically.
Right.
So
temporary visas in general, yeah, which would include both H-1B and student.
Right. Well, the issue is that, most people who come here permanently come here on a temporary visa first, and then they become permanent.
Oh, gotcha.
That's how, maybe 80% of all immigrants actually do it. They don't actually obtain the permanent visa outside, they obtain it inside. Mm-hmm. That's the most common way. Though the problem with the student visas, and I think that's the concern, that maybe China is sponsoring students to study in the United States and then bringing them back, so they're profiting from our system. But there's two sides to it. First, they're paying us a lot of money, so we're actually profiting from them. Second, if you don't want them to leave, then you should let them stay.
Right.
So then the question shouldn't be should we prohibit Chinese students from coming here? It should be, should we let them stay?
And encourage them to.
In fact, that's actually what we did after Tiananmen Square. George H.W. Bush and the Democratic Congress passed a bill that allowed all the Chinese international students who were here after Tiananmen Square happened, out of fear for political persecution when they went back, to stay in the United States. So there's precedent. And the other concern with H-1B visas is that what's the concern for you that you're thinking national security-wise?
Well, for me, I was just worried about the extent to which people who are temporary visa holders actually tend to stay in the U.S. A lot of that obviously is regulated by law that just doesn't allow them to transfer to EB visa holders and they can't get green cards.
That's right.
I was just wondering, from my perspective, I'm not sure, if the cultural attitudes of the vast majority of temporary visa holders. Is a consensus there that they would love to stay in America if they can, right? And as a result, we should, let them stay here, in my opinion. Or is it more of, here's a way that I can get a work visa, go there, and then come back to China later? If that's the case, that's where I'm more worried.
Right. The only way to know is to find out. I think that it's in the interest of the United States to have people who believe in American values and who are highly educated and innovative, who can create businesses, who can patent new things, to stay in the United States, and we should allow them to do so. Just like we should let investors to come here, and it's actually capped the number of investors, and there's a lot of Chinese investors.
That's EB-5 visas, right?
EB-5 visas. Mm-hmm. Now, their main argument against all of this is that, this is just the Chinese Communist Party. They are trying to steal, our companies and buy them. Look, there's already a prohibition on members of any Communist Party or any totalitarian party, and even human rights violators, from obtaining any green card in the United States. That's actually in the law.
Really?
And it's been there for decades, over 100 years now, that provision. So that's already prohibited. If you're concerned that there are communists obtaining green cards in the United States, then you should just enforce the law. That doesn't include people who are forced to join the party, right? So for example, in Nazi Germany, people were forced to join the Nazi party. Now, the question is, how do you distinguish between someone who is forced and someone who is not? Well, you look at their social media history. You ask them questions in the interview for the green card. This is why we have a screening process.
Right. Well, how do you feel then about Trump's travel ban, for example? which was first, touted to be like a Muslim ban and was credited for Islamophobia and all these things. But then obviously says, no, North Korea is also banned. I think Cuba was on the list as well.
Venezuela.
Exactly.
It was not Venezuela, really. It was just people who worked for the Venezuelan government, which I fully agree with on that.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts there, too? Because it seems to me the vetting process, I think what Trump did was just saying, look, there's certain countries, right, that pose a greater risk to people that are adversaries to the U.S. We're just going to halt immigration for a little bit. But I think you're right, too. The vetting process would look more about ideology. I'm inclined to believe that anyone who shares our values should be allowed to come here.
Everyone who shares our values and
can
contribute to the economy, right? You don't want to bring in everybody from.
I'll caveat that.
Yeah, but it's important. Well, I actually disagree very much with the travel ban.
Interesting.
Because, for example, let me give you an example. Iran was fully included in the ban, which means that anybody who was of Iranian citizenship or born in Iran was not allowed to enter the United States. What about somebody who is seeking asylum from Iran who is opposed to the Iranian regime? Why shouldn't they be allowed in? If your concern is that they're going to be terrorists, first, what share of people from Iran are terrorists? Like a very small percent. So you say, well, it's worth doing this against these other people because we have to protect ourselves. I don't think we can cite any major case of immigrants coming here legally from Iran on a permanent basis who were actually went on to become terrorists. And the fact is that actually Iran produces a lot of really highly educated people who oppose the regime because they are not really Islamists. And I have a friend who is one of those. She came right before the travel ban came into effect. She came in 2016. She lived in LA, like most Iranians who initially come to the United States. And her dad was one of the best engineers in Iran. He got permanent residency in the United States and brought him, his family. And, I just can't fathom why we shouldn't allow people who disagree with that Islamic radical ideology and are really smart and make a lot of money from coming to the United States and contributing and enriching us.
Absolutely. I think that's a very wise observation that obviously if we disagree with a country's ideology, broadly speaking, that doesn't mean we should ban people there from coming, but in fact, it's more of a reason why we should encourage people that are on our side to, come here, right?
And in fact, there's people coming from Europe and from other countries who have really bad ideas and are actually even not contributing. So I don't believe in differential treatment based on country of birth. I believe that we should have a uniform standard for all immigrants coming into the United States, saying that if you believe in American values, you're a net addition to our economy because you're going to be able to support yourself or you're going to create a business, patent things, then you should be allowed to stay in the United States. I
think that's something I'm very fortunate about too, and more of a reason why you and I can probably relate to this about why we love our country so much. My father's an immigrant, all my grandparents are immigrants, and very much the reason why I have the values I do and the love of America I do is because immigrants have seen how it's worse elsewhere. And I think coming to Colombia, it's very unfortunate for me to see all these people that hate America so much. And what's your perspective there, as someone who's in Venezuela for much longer and sees how the American system is just so much greater than everywhere else?
Yeah, look, when I walk in the street and I see an American flag, I just stop a little bit in my head and I think, wow, I am so lucky to be here.
Amen.
And I don't think that most other people see it that way, and I understand it's kind of weird and uncommon, but it's because when I was growing up, I saw my country fall apart because of policies that the people in power were implementing, and I didn't feel at home because of that. A lot of people initially in Venezuela were from Venezuela is this country of the north of South America, which has been ruled by 24 years by a socialist regime, so by my age. And a lot of people supported those policies. And I just didn't identify myself with that. That's changed. Now the culture is different. People actually want freedom in Venezuela, but it's not a democracy anymore, so they can't really choose freedom anymore.
It's too late now, yeah, absolutely.
It's too late. They're getting through votes, and now the only way out is through bullets.
That's right. Oh, wow. Good line, for sure. And I think that's something that people don't realize here, too, when they talk about democratic socialism. Like, simply because a lot of people happen to vote on a particular thing doesn't mean that it's going to create the conditions for the government that you would actually like. So what are some of the policies you mentioned that, kind of were walked into voluntarily, and now people are totally regretting in Venezuela.
Yeah, the first few things that Chavez did was that he thought that the rich were rich because the poor were poor. And that's not how things were actually in reality. But as a consequence of that thinking, what was the solution? If you believe that's the problem, then the solution is to take away the rich people's property and give it to the poor. And that's what started happening. He took over the big businesses. He nationalized them. He said that, basic products were too expensive, so we're going to increase welfare. We're going to give free housing. We're going to give free food. We're going to give free education, free healthcare. We're going to give free gasoline even. So all these welfare programs bankrupted Venezuela. And because of, there was not enough tax revenue and oil revenue even to pay for all this welfare, they had to print money to pay for it. And what's the consequence if you increase the money supply very quickly? Inflation. And so Venezuela has had for 10 years the highest inflation rate in the world. 10 years, the highest inflation rate in the world. We've had hyperinflation, one of the longest in world history.
Wow.
And so inflation went up from 10%, 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000% a year. So that you can wrap your head around what 1,000,000% a year is. Imagine that prices doubled every week. Something that costs $10 today costs 20 next week, 40, 80, 160, and really quickly it goes up.
Right. I'm in the math world too, so the exponential is terrifying to think about, right?
Right, and it got so bad that I couldn't fit enough cash in my wallet to pay for an empanada in my school cafeteria.
Wow.
What was the government's response to the inflation they caused? It was to say, it's the greedy businessmen who are raising prices to attack the Venezuelan people. And it's the American economic war. It's Bush, it's Obama, it's Trump, it's Biden. They blame whoever is in the United States. We started having blackouts because electricity became free, and then that meant who paid for electricity? No one, so the cables didn't get fixed. And of course, we started having blackouts. And the regime blamed iguanas. He said that the lizards were eating the cables.
Oh my gosh.
And then my favorite one was when they blamed Marco Rubio, the U.S. Senator from Florida. They said that he made a cyber attack all the way from Miami to Venezuela, destroying our electric grid. So it's all these insane conspiracy theory excuses to their failure, the failure of socialism. Mm-hmm. Why do I call this socialism? I think this is important actually, because a lot of people will hear this and say, Daniel, this is just a classic Latin American or world corruption country case. They're just corrupt, they're evil people. But that doesn't mean that socialism doesn't work in the United States. It just means those people were bad. And it's true, those people were bad, but that is indeed socialism. And that's what would happen here too. And let me explain why. What happens if you start increasing government spending in the United States, like with Medicare for All? Medicare for All would double government spending in the United States. Where would that money come from? We don't even have the money to finance current government spending. Imagine if we doubled it. We would start printing money. And guess what? That's exactly what we did during the pandemic. We spent a lot of money. There was not enough tax revenue to pay for it. And what happened with inflation? It went up to nearly 10%. We had a mini experiment in Venezuela during the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. And what did we feel? Supply chain problems, inflation, real wages are down, people suffered. Awesome. And they were claiming, we just want more government checks. No, the government checks were the cause of this inflation. And that's what caused the inflation in Venezuela too. And so what did we see here? We saw inflation, and what did the Democrats say? It's greed, the greedy oil companies that are raising oil prices. So we need to tax them, and we need to regulate them. And it's the same response that they did in Venezuela. The difference is the scale. Of course, if you repeat the policies of Venezuela, you're going to get the results of Venezuela. It's not rocket science.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's really good at addressing a lot of the concerns that people who are pro-socialism or even just playing with it a little bit have. So I was hoping you could answer a few of those. So one of them too, what you hear a lot is oh, the reason why regimes like Venezuela had such a difficult time are as a result of sanctions of trade, right? Places like the United States. I've asked this question before, and I think you gave an incredible answer that I was hoping people could hear it too. Why can't we just blame American sanctions for the failures of these socialist regimes?
Well, there's two answers. One is, if you think trade is bad and the United States and businesses are bad and greedy, why would you care about trading with the United States in the first place? I thought that's exactly what you didn't want to do. But aside from that, I think the best way to refute that is for people to think about Iran. Iran is a country that is oil dependent, that is totalitarian and corrupt, right? Nobody can tell me Iran is not corrupt. And that actually is, in a civil way, in political and civil freedoms, is much worse than Venezuela. Heck, in Iran, women can't, walk outside without covering their heads. In Venezuela, women can do that. In Iran, a couple of 20-something-year-olds, college students, I believe, were dancing in the street. They took a video and they both went to jail for that. In Venezuela, people can dance all they want. They take all the videos of themselves they want. There's no kind of religious oppression of that sort, okay? It's like the United States in that sense. Yet, Iran is under much more stringent sanctions than Venezuela. In Iran, you can't even send a piece of mail. In Iran, you can trade oil. Other countries sanctioned Iran. And it's really terrible. You can't send food or medicines. In Venezuela, you can trade with any Venezuelan from the United States. In fact, there are companies based in Houston, Miami, Orlando, and other cities that send food, medicines, and other items home to home from the United States to Caracas and other cities. I can send anything I want to my family. I can send cash, I can send Bitcoin, I can send anything. Yet, why is there much more inflation in Venezuela than in Iran? Why are there 7.1 million people fleeing Venezuela, the largest refugee crisis in the world? There are more Venezuelan refugees than Ukrainian refugees, okay? Or Syrian refugees abroad. People don't talk about that, right?
I didn't know that.
So there's more Venezuelan refugees than those countries. And there's no war in Venezuela. There's no chemical weapons. That's because Iran is not a socialist country. Iran is totalitarian, Islamic, whatever you want to call it. But in Iran, people have respected private property. And in Iran, people can open businesses and trade internally freely, much more freely than Venezuela, for sure. Not that everything is like a paradise free market. But it's not as socialist as Venezuela. So that's the only difference. So you cannot blame US sanctions, you cannot blame corruption, you cannot blame a host of other issues. You can only blame the policies of the government, and those are socialist policies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good test case that, really illuminated that point for me. Thank you so much. Yeah, and when it comes to also attributing where these economic issues come from, I think another sentiment that we hear a lot is, when the economy was good under Trump, people just said, well, these are Obama-era policies that are only finally starting to take place now, and they're having their effect now. And the reason why we have a recession now is not because of, old Joe Brandon, right? But Trump had these policies too that resulted in the inflation we see now. So what would you respond to someone who says that the current economic issues that we see, or the economic upset we see, are not as a result of the president that's currently in office?
I would agree that actually part of the inflation we saw is fault of Trump and the Republicans too, just as the Democrats. I mean, the stimulus checks were passed under the CARES Act that was actually very bipartisan and signed by Trump. So it's not like, this is Republicans' fault. This is everybody's fault. There was a second round of checks of $600 right before Trump, went out of office. That shouldn't have passed. And then Biden initially began with much more spending. So I certainly think that initially some of that was contributed by these stimulus checks that were passed during the Trump administration, but also supported by Democrats. But then really government spending took off during the Biden administration because they, just with their party, without Republican input, they increased spending tremendously through things like the supposedly Inflation Reduction Act, which actually increases inflation. It's an act that's named about inflation, but it's all about the environment. It's all to gaslight people into supporting it.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, so they have passed many bills that have really shot up our deficit. And as a consequence, we have seen a lot more aggregate demand in the economy, which means more money chasing the same number of goods. And what happens when more money chases the same number of goods? Prices go up.
Well, how do you know that we can attribute the various failures in supply chain things, the inflation that people feel every day in their wallets, to Biden-era policies rather than just the inefficiencies that are inevitable from something like COVID? How can we make that link there for sure?
That's a good point. And the ways to see what happens, first, what's the causation mechanism, and second, what happened in other countries. The United States was not the only country to stimulate aggregate demand through government spending, okay? It happened almost everywhere around the world. And in the countries that did it, inflation went up tremendously. Europe did it actually to a much less extent. Now they have similar inflation to us. Not because they, you'd say, well, but they have the same inflation, so why would you blame it on spending? Because Europe has the same overall inflation, but it's almost entirely driven by energy prices in Europe, not here. Here, it's actually not driven by electricity. In some European countries, electricity went up 10 times.
Interesting.
10 times, I'm talking about. It was a crisis.
Wow, yeah.
Because they were dependent on Russian gas. So the cause of much of Europe's inflation is actually Russia's fault, not ours. We're not actually as affected by that at all. In our case, was 100% the stimulus of aggregate demand made by the government. So if we had, all else equal, if we had done the same, stimulus spending as, say, some European countries, which is less than what we did in reality, then we would have had lower inflation. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that the war in Ukraine didn't increase our inflation, or supply chain problems didn't increase our inflation. Certainly it did. And certainly it's also not just the Congress's fault. It's also the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was running its quantitative easing program, buying U.S. bonds very late into 2021 and 2022. They shouldn't have done that. And they should have started raising interest rates much earlier. They have themselves admitted it, that they were wrong. And that's all I'm saying.
Wow, that's kind of scary to see, right? All the different. I think you have the advantage of having these international perspectives and comparing America to all these other areas, right? And seeing the ways in which, our policy decisions have therefore affected our economy in really unique ways. My question to you too, as someone who is in both the political world, you've met President Trump, you've been all over Fox News, you're obviously a very talented speaker. You also are an academic. You go to school at Columbia, and you're an incredible scholar too at IU, where you got the special scholarship there. Is a whole accomplishment in and of itself. But why do you think then, when you go to these higher up places where you can see the causality, where you can see how these various policies have real world ramifications on things like people's lives, that there's still so much reluctance, even amongst academic econ people, to more of an Austrian view of economics? Do you think that's the case? It's like Chicago is known to be one of the best econ programs, and they're totally Austrian, right?
Well, they're not.
Not anymore, really?
No, they were never really Austrian economists.
Oh, so sure.
They were more monetarist, more of this Chicago school.
Did?
Yeah. Austrian economists are very few.
Really?
Yeah. I wouldn't consider myself an Austrian economist.
Oh, you wouldn't? Okay, fair enough.
I wouldn't qualify myself as any. Austrian economists, for our listeners, is like a school of thought, of economic thought. I think it has done many important contributions. It's just not my current thinking. I wouldn't qualify myself as part of any school.
Sure. So, sorry, other than from school, why do you think then, why do you think that the views you have, the views that you and I share
are not shared as much in academia?
In academia, precisely, the people that should be knowing the causality more clear.
Well, I think that they used to be shared more, at least in the economics field. I think more recently, a lot of social issues have been driving the economic thought. So, really, the prime way people are identifying themselves politically is not more about whether they want free markets or more government control or lower, higher taxes, more or less regulation. It's actually, do we want abortion? Do we want gay marriage? Do we want this affirmative action? Do we want this whatever other policy? And because the social issues have come to dominate the economic issues, somebody who is among highly educated people, I think there's this pressure to just research that and not talk about these free market policies that would go against what many on the left would think, right? Because say you're pro-choice, right? And that's your top issue. You really care about that. But you're otherwise pretty free market person. Then what's happening, I think, is that you will not really say these things for a free market because the other people who are pro-choice are very anti-market. And so you don't want to alienate those people. You want to appeal to them.
Sure, but I guess why can't one be pro-choice and also free market? I mean,
I think you should be you should be free market regardless of any other of your social views.
Right, my thinking here is exactly. Do you think it's along the lines of just people realizing that the inequality that occurs? I mean, inequality is inevitable, right? I think Solzhenitsyn said it so aptly too that there's always going to be a trade-off between equality and freedom. Right?
Not always, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, is the reason why people don't like free markets just because inevitably there's going to be billionaires and non-billionaires, right?
Well, I think some people are really uncomfortable by inequality. Mm-hmm. I am not. I think inequality can be good or can be bad. I don't think it's inherently a good or a bad thing. I think that inequality out of the result of effort and
skill.
Skill, even, genetic skill. Some people are born with great music ear, I was not. And of course, the people who are musicians deserve to make a lot of money if they are successful, in other people liking their music. And I think that that's not just neutral morally, I think that that's just and right.
Absolutely. I mean, I want my neurosurgeon, right, to be someone that is competent at neurosurgery.
Yeah.
And the people that are in these various fields to be there because they're paid higher because they're qualified for them, right?
And some people are where they are in part because of luck. Everybody has a little bit of luck. Or God is guiding us, however you want to call it, right?
Well, we call it grace, right? I mean, I think that's how it ought to be conceived.
But sometimes disasters happen and bad things happen to good people too.
Right, and that's the role of the church and the role of the family, right?
Yes, so and as a consequence, I think a lot of people are really outraged by people suffering from what they see as unjust causes. But I think that that's separate from the issue of whether there should be inequality at all. Some people believe there should be no billionaires, for example. I've heard this.
And that's a philosophical issue.
Why should there be no billionaires? I mean, first, that comes from the view that some people have much more than they need, right? Who defines what we need? We don't need anything. We just need to eat and, basically survive.
Right.
We are all much wealthier, multiple times that of what we actually need physiologically.
Right. The greatest kings in all of human history wish they had air conditioning, they had plumbing like we do. Right. We're like, if you just compare us aggregately, like the people that live in the 21st century like we do, right, have enormous wealth compared to people centuries ago.
And the fact that some people have more than others, I'm totally not bothered by that. I am bothered by the fact that in the United States there's a lot of barriers to success for people who are really poor. Right? I want more opportunities for everyone. I don't want to close a gap. I want the poor to be better because I think they're the ones doing worse off. And the question is, how do we achieve that? I don't think the way to achieve that is to take away money from the rich. I actually think the way to achieve that is to lift all the barriers that the government has put on their success. Look, I went to one of the migrant shelters in Times Square and I talked with a Colombian family who had just arrived from the southern border.
Colombian
family, Colombia. Correct. And I am at Columbia University, which is different, with a U instead of an O. But this family was actually from the country of Colombia in South America. And their big issue was that they couldn't work because the husband was a barber. And to be a barber, you need a barber's license in New York State. The wife used to be a nail salon worker. Guess what? You also need a license to be a nail salon worker. And you know how much these things cost?
Yeah.
Not just hundreds of dollars, but thousands of hours of training that is unpaid, and then do a test. I mean, these people, how do you expect to survive while you're waiting? So the guys, I'm not going to say it, but I shouldn't say, what he's doing for a living, because then the government could get him in trouble because of freaking license issues. But this is all stupid regulations.
That's right. The lack of upward mobility in a case like that you mentioned is not as a result of, the big corporate bigwigs putting their boots on the table and, rigging all the oil companies. It's because of government regulations.
That's right.
Are overreaching in people's lives.
So we have that huge problem with licensing, and that's a state issue, by the way. And then we have a problem with things like zoning. Housing is very expensive in the United States. And especially New York City, as you probably know. I certainly know it. And the big reason that happens is because supply is constrained. Supply is not constrained because we can't build more in New York City. There are actually fewer people living today in Manhattan than there used to be 100 years ago. Supply is constrained because we prohibit building tall buildings in Manhattan. Believe it or not, there are actually height limits in Manhattan.
That's crazy, wow.
We have years of environmental review processes that make building prohibitively expensive and increase the cost of apartments because of this ideology that the environment comes before the person. And that's something that is very, now popular in the left. But, I think that I would rather house a lot of poor people in cheaper apartments than to do years of environmental review processes in Manhattan, where we're actually reducing pollution by having more people living in cities like New York, where they don't need cars, where they can walk to places. So it's actually environmentally friendly.
Are you familiar with the Kuznets curve?
Yes.
I'm sure you are. Oh, that's in high school. My friends and I talk about actually middle school. The Kuznets curve, right? That economic development and environmental growth. Economic development and environmental degradation are not actually zero sum, right? You can actually have economic growth, and that actually promotes a lot of environmental effects too that are really beneficial.
Yeah.
And it's been cool seeing that people in the upper levels of economics are observant of the same things, right?
Yeah, the United States right now is emitting less CO2 a year than it did 10 years ago, despite the economy being much larger. And there being more people living in the United States. And that trend is going to continue. The question is, do we will let it continue? For that, we need to grow. Because the only way we can actually help the environment is to have enough money to care about the environment. Caring about the environment is a rich person's problem, okay? It's not a problem that people in Africa are dealing with. Right now, they're going to drill oil from a national park in Uganda, for example. And you know what? That's what that country needs, because they don't have electricity.
Right.
And I'd rather feed the population that is starving than to take care of some other things. And that's, I understand, it's, some people might disagree, oh, you're destroying the environment. Well, but how are you going to tell that to somebody who is in extreme poverty in Africa?
Right.
That they can't develop their own country like we did in the past.
What a to say, yeah. Well, one argument I've heard against that, though, is that the reason why America has been able to lower its emissions is in large part due to the fact that we relegated a lot of our economic degradation to the global south. And what's the response you have to that? Because that's an argument I've heard a few times.
So no, it's really because we consume less coal. That's a big reason. We consume less coal and we consume more natural gas. And natural gas pollutes a lot less than coal because our cars are more efficient. So we're actually consuming less gasoline in the United States than we did 10 or 20 years ago, despite there being many, many more cars.
Oh, wow.
And that's because regular cars, it's not because of electric cars. It's because electric cars are like 1% of all the cars. Regular cars are much more efficient. And then you could actually argue that that's because of regulations on cars. That's fine, you can say that, but you can't say it's because we're exporting more pollution. In fact, a big problem with regulating, say, oil production in the United States is that it's less environmentally damaging to extract a barrel of oil in Texas than it is to extract a barrel of oil in Africa or Russia or Asia. So if we could actually increase our oil production, we would replace the oil production of other more polluting countries. And so this is why when we talk about the environment, we have to be nuanced and we have to think things through. We can't just say, oh, oil bad, let's produce less. No, wait a minute. Let's think of the consequence of each of the things that you do and see if it actually helps the environment. My favorite example is plastic bags. There's a really great book.
Tell me about it, yeah.
Yeah, that where I read this and it cites all the different calculations. Turns out that using these reusable bags is actually worse for the environment than plastic bags.
Really? Why is that?
Because in order, the plastic bags that we use nowadays are very thin and they use very little plastic.
Nothing, yeah.
It's very different from the past. And these reusable bags are like sewed, like they need a lot of water to be produced.
You use them, you buy a new one anyways, yeah.
Exactly. And so you would need to reduce one of these traditional reusable bags like 10,000 times before they're better for the environment than using plastic bags.
Wow.
Nobody reuses them enough.
That is crazy.
And that is if you don't wash it. If you wash it, then you're spending water and soap, and then it's worse for the environment.
Right. I'll just preserve mine, after 10,000 uses.
So it's all these measures are to feel good, but they don't actually do good to the environment.
Right. And from the perspective of someone who's, in economics, you of course have to measure these things in a very calculated way, where you actually see the math behind it and you see how things are optimized. and it's lovely having your perspective. Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
We're running, I don't want to be a second of your time, Daniel. Last thing I want to ask you about in particular is your Project Dissident, which you were mentioning earlier too. You've been traveling all over the place, telling people about the dangers of socialism and a lot of the other things you've learned. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project and how that's been going so far?
Yeah, the Dissident Project is a nonprofit that sends immigrants in the United States who came here from authoritarian, left-wing, socialist-like governments. And the goal is to send them to high schools at no cost in order to tell our stories to the high school kids and achieve two things. One, allow the students to be grateful to live in America. Because, we have stories like that of Angesom. He's from Eritrea. Eritrea is also called the North Korea of Africa. It's illegal to leave Eritrea. There's almost no private property and everybody serves in the military, including Angesom. And he says that I didn't know what choice was until I came to America. I didn't know what choice was until I came to America. And that's because there was no choice of cereal. There was no choice of even where to live, what your job was when you lived in Eritrea. And so these are the kinds of stories that I think Americans need to hear to have some perspective. I think we hear a lot of negative things about America without hearing how things are in other countries. And then the second goal is to help them understand that free enterprise, that is people being allowed to trade freely with others without the government stopping them from working with each other, is what has allowed America to be so prosperous and rich. And that's what's really destroyed the economies of other countries. And so that's what we want to do. We have 5 speakers now from Eritrea, North Korea, Venezuela, and Hong Kong. And now we're going to have 13 speakers starting next month, including people from Zimbabwe, from mainland China, including one of the people who was in Tiananmen Square.
Wow.
We're going to have people from Syria. We're going to have people from Cuba. And so we're expanding in order to reach more high schools. And this is all at no cost to the high school. The only thing people have to do to reach us is go to our website, which is dissidentproject.org. And they can send us a message through there and we'll book it to their high school.
Incredible. Wow. More people need to hear your message, Daniel. Thank you so much. And I can imagine how brave that is too, because I've heard stories of North Korean defectors, for example, who have bounties on their heads, right, for trying to escape and saying all these things. So is there a risk that you see there too of these people that are traveling?
There's always a risk, but we live in America, which is where we can afford to say what we think. We didn't come to America to shut up.
Amen.
Right? I didn't come to the United States so that people here would tell me what I can say or what I cannot say. If I was concerned about that, I would have stayed in Venezuela, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have come to America. And our North Korean speaker has gone through a lot. Okay, I think she's very much willing to speak. After all, she's suffered because of this totalitarian government.
Amen. And lastly, I have to ask, what are your favorite things about America? Just so people can be more grateful about them too.
My favorite thing is the grocery stores. Because
bags,
yes, I love the grocery stores and having choices there, and I love the people of America. I think that the American people are very different from people in Europe and other regions. I think Americans are much more tolerant, are much more respectful, and are much more admiring of entrepreneurship and risk taking than any other society there is. And even in things like supporting personal rights, even people in the left in the United States are super supportive of free speech or privacy, things. People get mad if the rights are violated. Okay, let's say you will sue someone else if your rights are violated. That's not what happens in most other countries. And I mentioned tolerance because I have many Venezuelan friends who have emigrated to other countries. And believe me when I tell you, the rest of Latin America really discriminates against Venezuelans based on our accent or where we come from. There's a lot of xenophobia in the rest of Latin America, much more than in the United States. So this false belief that the United States is a racist country is that it's a false belief.
Oh yeah, Asians have a huge history of this too, which is terrible, right? People think that racism is a uniquely American problem, when obviously we have our fair share of historical ills.
But really, we're one of the least racist countries in the world, I would say.
Absolutely. We're like the country that's founded off of diversity, right? And I think that's a really beautiful thing that's unique about us. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, you heard him here. Thank you so much, Daniel Martino. I'll make sure that people check out the Dissident project, and I look forward to seeing so much more of your incredible work, hopefully in Fox News again or wherever else you might end up being.
Thank you, Ashley.